So thank you very much for that kind introduction. When my students ask me, are you a molecular biologist, a moral theologian, which one are you? I say I'm first a priest. And so I'm here as a priest of Jesus Christ, who is working through the challenges of trying to bring together a scientific worldview that incorporates evolutionary theory and the truths of sacred revelation as it has been articulated in sacred scripture and the tradition of the Catholic Church. And I was speaking to the seminarians this morning. Because I'm a priest of Jesus Christ, you know, it weirds my colleagues in the scientific field when I go into a conference as a priest, because they're not quite sure how to treat me. And when my students and I go to a conference, one of the first questions they always get when other scientists see me with them is they say, "Why are you with a priest?" And not surprisingly, they'll explain that I am not just their priest, but I'm also their PI. A PI is a principal investigator, the head of a laboratory. And the very first question they always ask my students is, well, does he believe in evolution? And I've told my students over and over again that I am a proponent of evolution because I am convicted that the data for evolution is robust. And that's really the starting point that I'm going to presume here in this lecture. One of the things that non-biologists do not often appreciate is that evolutionary theory for a biologist is like the doctrine of the Trinity for a Christian. It is the organizing principle for how we do everything that we do. And what I hope to show you today is that a robust understanding of evolutionary theory can be reconciled with a full-blown, faithful and orthodox account of how God has worked in this incredible, beautiful universe that we live in. And so what I'm going to do today is to try to do that by making an argument for why I think it is reasonable to claim that Adam really, truly existed. So this is a very controversial point. So if this is a book published a couple of years ago. Jack Mahoney, who is a Jesuit priest who I believe is now retired at a Boston college, he wrote a book called Christianity and Evolution. And I'm just going to hold. So he wrote a book on Christianity and evolution, and in the book he basically says this: I argue that with the acceptance of the evolutionary origin of humanity, there is no longer a need or a place in Christian beliefs for the traditional doctrines of original sin, the fall, and human concupiscence resulting from that sin. Now he's not alone in holding this view. So this is John Hott, who is a Catholic theologian at Georgetown University. He will say, evolutionary science has rendered the original cosmic perfection, one allegedly debauched by temporally original sin, obsolete and unbelievable. And what I'm going to do is I would like to respond to these Catholic theologians and basically present a view that will argue that it is not in fact unreasonable to think that there was a historical Adam, and that this historical Adam underwent a fall, and that the tradition is actually correct and true, and it explains so much not only about who we are, but who God is. And for Catholic Christians, this is actually part of our faith. So in the Council of Trent, in the decree concerning original sin in 1546, it was defined de fide that if anyone who does not confess that the first man, Adam, when he transgressed the commandment of God in paradise, immediately lost the holiness and justice of which he has been constituted, let him be anathema. And in Latin, this is anathema sit. This is the formula that has been used over the last 2,000 years to define Catholic doctrine per se. And so I'd like to explore this with you. How exactly can we take the very best of science, the very best of theology and philosophy, and bring them together? And because this is a philosophy lecture, I'm actually going to focus primarily on the philosophy, but there are theology slides after the end, just in case any of you raise questions regarding original sin and the fall itself. And so this is the question I'd like to discuss in this lecture today. How should Catholic Christians come to terms with the scientific and theological debate over the historicity of Adam and Eve? And I have friends who are evangelicals and Reformed theologians, and they're struggling with this. They're not quite sure how to reconcile a reading of Genesis with the very best of evolutionary theory. Now, I'm going to rely on Thomas Aquinas, not only because I'm a Dominican, but because I think he's just right. And so I'm going to sit here and I'm going to use Thomas, even though it's 800 years of wisdom, to try to help us to understand evolutionary theory. Now, it's clear that Thomas himself did not know of evolution, but what I would like to propose to you is that his philosophical scheme and his theological insights can be used, in fact, to understand the very best of science and the very best of theology today. So my lecture is going to be divided into 4 parts. The very first part is I'm going to have to talk about evolution per se from a philosophical perspective to answer this question: how and why did God create through evolution? Now, often when I go out there, people will oppose creation and evolution. They will say it either happened through creation or it happened through evolution. And what I'm going to explain to you today using Aquinas is to argue that it is reasonable to claim that God creates through evolution. And in fact, Thomas has certain principles, theological principles, that would have us expect him to have created through evolution. More about that in a minute. Then I'm going to deal with the science. What does the science say about the origins of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens? So you have philosophy, theology, science, then we're going to do some theology and talk about what has the church said regarding the question of the original Adam and Eve. And I'm going to do some speculative philosophy theology to propose one way of trying to reconcile all of these 3 things together. So I'm going to begin now with how and why God created through evolution. So here's a question: how does God create through evolution? I'm just going to assume for now that he did that. And again, there are slides at the very end of my talk if you want to talk about evolution and the actual science of evolution and why I believe evolution makes sense. We can talk about that at the very end during the Q&A. But I'm going to assume for now that evolution is true. And I'm going to ask this question: if evolution is true, if the evolutionary mechanisms are true, how did God use evolution to create life as we know it? And in order to do this, I need to ask this question: how do creatures act? How do you and I act? Because this is the kind of action that you and I are most familiar with. And it's interesting, when we see ourselves act, or others act, or dogs act, or cats act, we see our actions primarily as moving matter from one place to another. And so not surprisingly, when we think about how God acts, we often assume that God is just a very, very powerful human being. And so when we think about God's action, divine causality in the world, we often seem to think, and I find this of many, many different people, that God is just a Superman. And one of the things that is at the heart of St. Thomas Aquinas' account of God is radically different from us. And so if he's radically different from us, he's going to act in a radically different way. So we imagine this. We imagine that actors and actions can be reduced to forces interacting with matter in a universe of change and time. But I'm going to propose to you that God, because he is God, can do things that you and I can't do. Now that makes sense. He's God, we're not, as St. Catherine of Siena pointed out. But we don't usually embrace that. We don't really understand what that means. So when we ask the question, how does God act? We have to remember that God, the Creator, is radically different from his creatures. And in a way I cannot explain right now. I'm just going to rely on the authority of Aquinas. He has made some beautiful arguments for this. God is a verb. We are nouns. And so God is a substantial verb. And these are words I'm going to use completely analogously. And if anyone knows what analogy is, you understand what I'm talking about. But what I'm saying here is that we often assume God is a noun, just like us. And so we usually imagine God acting like we act. but he is not. He is a verb, we are nouns. And Thomas would say this. He would say in the question 3, article 3 of his Summa, he would say God is the act of existing. This is why I'm making the claim that properly speaking, God is a verb. He's a personal verb with intellect and will. Now there are philosophical arguments for why God can be understood in this way, and I hope that the seminarians doing philosophy will have that opportunity to understand this. But this is just a given, that God is a verb, we are nouns. Now, this is philosophy. Aquinas will point out that it's really cool that when you look at theology, if you look at Exodus 3:14, when Moses asks God, "What's your name?" he says, "I am who am." Now, really, it's interesting. If you look at it properly speaking, God will say, "I am ising." I am the act of being. I am ising. I am a verb. And the verb is deeply tied to existence. The very act of existence is what God is all about. So Thomas will say, this is one of those points where philosophy and theology, a very sound argument from first principles, comes together and meets the revelation of sacred scripture, in this case in the book of Exodus. So we should expect, because he is a verb and we are nouns, that the Creator is going to act in a radically different way from how you and I act. And this is done, and Thomas will say that he acts primarily by giving existence to matter and to forces. Creatures cannot give existence to themselves or to each other. And if I ask Jamie here, and this is just to illustrate that, because it's really important for you to understand what I mean by this. You know, if I ask my students, if I ask Jamie, I say, "Jamie, why are you awake? Why are you not sleeping?" He's going to say, "Well, I am keeping myself up. And in fact, if you get boring, Father, I'll just fall asleep." Right? So he can do that. He has within his power the ability to stay up or to actually allow him to fall asleep. But if I ask Jamie, "Jamie, why do you exist? Why do you exist?" As in being here, real, right now. He cannot say, "Well, that's because I'm keeping myself in existence." Because if he did that, I'd say, "Okay, stop doing that, let's see you disappear." And he can't. In fact, none of us can do that. We cannot will ourselves out of existence. We do not will ourselves into existence either, and we are not willing ourselves into existence at this point in time. And so there are philosophical arguments to be made as to try to seek a causal explanation for this. Why do you exist? I'm not asking, why are you alive? There's a lot of my students will say, "Well, if I wanted to stop existing, I'd just kill myself." I'm not talking about that, because there's life and there's death. The opposite of existing is annihilation. You simply cease to be. The atoms in your body just disappear. They're gone. Now, you can't do that. And in fact, physics can't explain why your atoms sitting right now are doing what they're doing. This is in the realm of metaphysics. That's why the seminarians here have to take metaphysics. They have to understand that. So creatures cannot give existence to themselves or to each other. Parents can give life to their children, but they cannot give existence to their children. And so what God does is he gives existence to matter, but as particular kinds of things with specific natures. And I'm going to have to explain this in more detail. How does he do that? How does God do this? I'm going to use an example. I'm going to say an author writing a note with a pen. Here it is. Here's the pen. And if I asked you this question, who wrote the pen? Who wrote the note? Right? Who wrote the note? You can say the author wrote the note, but notice the pen wrote the note too. In fact, if I took the pen away, the author would not be able to write that note. And so both the author and the pen are both acting together to write the note. Now, Thomas will call the author the principal cause, and the pen is the instrumental cause. Now, you notice they're working together. The author is being fully author, and the pen is being fully pen, and they're both doing something together in order to generate the note. And the note has characteristics of both causes. So the author's handwriting comes from the author, but the pen's ink color comes from the pen. And so you can look at this note, and the note has signs of two causes, the instrumental cause and the principal cause, and they're working together. Notice they're not at odds with each other. We're not saying the author or the pen. We're saying the author and the pen together fully are working to generate and create this note. So notice what's really striking is the pen is not really a pen until the author uses it to write. And this is we could talk about this all night. But if I use a pen, right, and I can use it as a doorstop, right? I can stick it up my nose. Some of my students do that. So they stuck it up. So what happens is you can use it for many things, but it's properly used as a pen when the author uses the pen to write. So without an author, a pen cannot really be a pen, you see? Because the pen presupposes, in many ways, when it was created, that it would be used one day to write. Now, this is an analogy, this is an example to talk about the relationship between the Creator and his creatures. So, for example, if a rose bush blooms a rose, this is winter, it's not the best time to talk about this, but spring, for example. You see a brand new rose bush. There's a rose bush and there's a rose. Now this is the question, is God acting there too? Now this is striking because if you ask my biology colleagues, they'll say no. Biology can explain everything that gives rise to that rose. But if you look at it metaphysically, you're going to have to admit that there are dimensions of that rose that cannot be explained by biology. Let me explain. So when a rose bush blooms a rose, the rose that did not exist comes into existence. Do you see that? Before the rose, there was no rose, and now there's a rose. That rose didn't have existence before. And as I told you, as I suggested to you, creatures can't give existence to other creatures. You can't even give existence to yourself. You have to receive it from another. And so the rose bush cannot give existence to the rose. So philosophically, we will say that the rose must receive its existence from the first cause. And the first cause is just another complicated way for saying God. And so at the end of the day, God has to act when a rose bush blooms a rose. And the way we explain this is that he creates the rose bush. He gives the rose bush nature that allows it to bloom a rose. He acts with the rose bush so that it can bloom a rose, it can produce an existing rose. So in all of these are different facets of God acting while the rose bush is doing what it's biologically capable of doing. Now this applies to us as well. Now I want you to imagine an apple. Can you imagine an apple? Now, notice 2 seconds ago, that image of the apple wasn't there. So it actually had to have received its existence. And so Aquinas will point out that God is even working there. You were thinking, he was working with you to give the thought that you were thinking the existence that it needed to have in order for you to think about it. So you are both working together. Now you notice it's not you or God. It's not you duking it out with God. It's both of you acting together all the time. And this is primarily because he is the only one who can give existence to anything that didn't have existence before. Now, when I was teaching this in my honors colloquium at Providence College, one of my students just yelled out, he goes, "Oh my goodness, I just discovered something." And I said, "What?" "I am God's imaginary friend." And there is a certain truth to that. Because you see, when you and I have imaginary friends, they stay imaginary, right? So J.K. Rowling, when she imagined Harry Potter, regardless of what my students think, he's not really real, But he remains real in a limited way. He has imaginary reality, existence. But when God imagines you and me, he is able to imagine you and me into reality. And this actually, spiritually, this should be consoling to you. I have students who come up to me and they'll say, you know, Father, I don't think God loves me anymore. I don't think he thinks about me. And I said, go look at the mirror. And I go, are you there? And he goes, yeah, I'm there. Well, if you are there, he's still thinking about you. Because if he stops thinking about you, you disappear. Just like if I ask you to think about an apple, and then I start I ask you to think about a pineapple, what will happen is when you switch from one thought to the other, the first thought ceases to be. And because we are real thoughts of God, this is one of the great insights of Thomas Aquinas. Because we exist, we are real thoughts of him. And so he is constantly working in the world. A lot of people don't realize that whenever there is a snow, there's a blizzard. And if you go out into the blizzard, one of the things you have to realize is that every single one of those snowflakes, because they exist, each snowflake is a thought of God. God has thought every single snowflake. And so he is acting even there. He acts through nature and with nature to realize a universe. So the rose bush is an instrumental cause where God is the principal cause. This is what I want to really impress upon you. Both God and the rose bush are acting when the rose blooms. Now, think about that. The rose has characteristics that it receives from God in the rose bush. Remember, the note has both the handwriting and the ink. And so it is existing because of God. It is a rose because of the rose bush. And both causes come together to generate life. No, so God gives creatures their existing. He gives creatures their natures. And he acts with creatures to realize the perfection of their natures. Now you notice, this is how we have to understand evolution. Because when God's acting with creatures, with dynamic natures, interact with each other, we call this evolution. Now a lot of people will think that evolution by nature cannot have God in it. And one of the things that Thomas Aquinas helps us to understand and to see is that you can never remove God from a natural process if that process exists. Because God is the necessary prerequisite for that thing existing. So the evolutionary process, as it has unfolded over the last several billion years, is an example of God working in an incredibly clear and beautiful way in our world. So now, and you see, this is the International Theological Commission. So this is kind of like the committee of the church's best theologians, and they meet in Rome. And at that point in time, in 2004, they published a document called Communion and Stewardship. And the chair of that community was then Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, now the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. And in that document, they cite Thomas Aquinas to basically say what it took me 20 minutes to say. God works with and through natures. And so nature is always chock full of divine activity. Now, so this is why we can say God creates through evolution. And this is even more shocking to my secular friends. We can say God designs through chance. Now, you and I we often think of design and chance as opposing. But Aquinas gives us a way to understand how it is reasonable to claim, with God and only God, how you can actually design through chance. It can really be chance, and it can really be designed simultaneously. If you and I attempted to do that, we couldn't. It would either have to be design or chance, right? If I started to design a pair of dice in a casino, they'd call it cheating. But that's because we're not God. Now, here's a question. Why does God create through evolution? And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to rely on Aquinas. And so I'm going back to question 103, Article 6 in the Summa. Thomas will say this: if God governed alone, things would be deprived of the perfection of causality, wherefore all that is effected by many would not be accomplished by one. What does this mean in English? It means this. You and I can write books. You and I can write poems. You and I can write. But you and I cannot make a book that writes itself. And one of the things that Thomas wants to communicate is that one of the things that God does is he shares his causality. He allows creatures to act with and through him in order to be true causes. And when you understand this, you'll understand why for Catholics, for example, I mentioned this in my lectures this morning, I have my Protestant friends will always say, why do I have to go to confession to a priest? Can't I just go to God directly? And I say, absolutely. And you should be going to God every night and asking him for forgiveness. But in his providence, he has chosen priests to act as instrumental causes for that forgiveness. So he calls us to cooperate with him. A priest is called to be an instrumental cause. I can't forgive sins, but I am a pen. He is the author. And through that causality, I am able to forgive sins in his name. Now, why is that? Again, it's this principle. God wants to share his causality with his creatures. So it's really striking. For Thomas, you would want God to create through evolution, because evolution is actually more revelatory of his power than special creation. This is a very strange thing to think, because we think that it's really cool for God to say, dog, and there's a dog right there. And that's special creation. But Thomas will say that God, being God, can make books that write themselves. And so he has made a universe that can generate novelty and can generate beauty with him, not separate from him, but with and alongside him. So in this way, he more fully communicates his perfection. He more clearly manifests his glory. Lao Tzu, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. So I'm using this in an analogous way. Don't just make the animals, give matter the ability to make animals. That's even more powerful. The second thing that Thomas will say is the following. He says, for God brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures. Translation into English. If you wanted to go and try to figure out who a painter is, would you choose to look at one painting, or would you go to a gallery of all of his paintings? And my students will say the gallery. The gallery is able to better represent his talent. It is better able to represent his intuition, his insights. You've got the still life, you've got the landscape, you've got the self-portrait. And each one of these different paintings reveals one dimension of the painter. Thomas will say that this is the reason why God created many things, because no one thing can properly show us what God is. So he created dogs and cats and peacocks and bats. All of this diversity is there to reveal the incredible diversity, beauty, the inexplicable complexity of his simplicity. All right? And I know I said something contradictory, but that's God. So now notice what happens, right? If you ask how many species are present in the world today, there are about 8 million. If you have an evolutionary view, how many species could God have made? 4 billion. So which is cooler? A gallery with 4 billion pictures or a gallery with 8 million pictures? And because there's so many, God is able to represent himself more beautifully. Another thing is you cannot put a T-Rex and an elephant in the same ecosystem, right? One is going to eat the other very quickly. So if you wanted these two forms of life to reflect your glory, one of the things is you can separate them in time. You can have the reptiles over here, and then you have the KT boundary 70 million years ago, and boom, you now have the mammals. We can't live them together. You can't have, I mean, yes, you can watch movies where dinosaurs go running after humans as food. It's the kind of biology that we're talking about. You just can't have an incredibly diverse reptilian population living side by side with the diverse mammalian system today. It just won't work. And so this is one way to explain how God could have done this. He just had a gallery not separated in rooms, but over eons, over time. All right, there it is. There's this gallery of pictures. So that's just to give you a theological reflection, theological reflection on evolution. I'm now going to get to the science. I'm just going to say, what can science tell us about our origins? And this is a slide that I used this morning. This is just to summarize what the genome is. So a genome is all the genetic information of the organism, and you can find it primarily in the chromosomes that can be found in the nucleus. For some of you, biology has been a while, so I wanted to kind of just give you some basic cell biology background. And the idea is if you take a chromosome and you stretch it out, it's a DNA double helix, the very famous DNA double helix. Now, because these are chemicals, we have to depict them, describe them in text in a particular way, and we do that by using letters. So the human genome DNA is made up of 4 kinds of molecules, and each molecule is depicted by a letter, G, A, T, C. And the information of the genome can basically be depicted by 3 billion of these letters. So your genome is about 3 billion bases long. This happens to be the gene that my students and I discovered 7 years ago. This is the gene that we're working on. This is a gene that is involved in cancer. It's important in kidney cancer, certain blood cancers, breast cancer, and a brain cancer called glioma. And for the last 7 years, my students and I in my research laboratory have been trying to figure what this does. We now think we know what it does. It's a pH-sensitive calcium leak. I'm not going to explain what that means. And we've just started looking for new chemotherapeutic drugs to try to prevent this from doing what it's doing, to add to the arsenal of chemo agents that our oncologists have. The take-home message is that the gene is letters. It can be depicted as letters, where each letter is a molecule. And so you can see that biologists can compare and contrast genomes like Scripture scholars can compare and contrast manuscripts in the history of sacred Scripture. Because genomes can be depicted as text, and they can be understood as text, and so you can compare text. You can look at this manuscript and you can say, this manuscript is older than that manuscript. This manuscript is related to this manuscript in this way, but this one is an outlier. This manuscript is not related to these 2 manuscripts. Biologists do the same thing. We can actually do that, and we can compare and contrast different genomes to identify the relationships between these genomes. So here, think about 10 final exams with similar answers. What does this tell us about the relationships among them? And I do this in a seminary because exams are part of our life. So if you're a professor and you see, it doesn't happen here at St. Charles, I'm sure, but if you have 10 exams and 4 of them share answers, you go, we call that cheating. Now, notice, cheating is common origin. So this woman is looking at her classmate's exam, and so her exam and these 2 exams have a common origin. This one is the original. This one is derived from that. And we can do that by comparing answers. And we can actually figure out who copied earlier versus who copied later by looking at how much these 2 exams overlap. So if you have 2 exams that only share 1 essay question out of 10 in common versus 2 exams that share all 10 in common, you would have to say that the cheater was able to cheat soon earlier, so he was able to copy all 10 answers, and that he was able to see the exam pretty much and copy the exam in a way that's different from the other two, where one was only able to copy one because, say, for example, the other 9 had not yet been written yet. And so we can look at the historical relationship between exams to figure out who cheated from whom. And we do the same thing with genomes. So this is casein beta, which is the most common protein in cow's milk. And this is the genes. And we can compare them. And one of the things you will notice is that there's a T here, and all of them there's T's here, then there's an A here. Now you get a situation where there's all G's, there's T's, and you can basically imagine each one of these letters as an answer on an exam, and we can try to figure out who copied from whom. And by figuring out who copied from whom, you can look at the relationships of descent amongst the different organisms. It's striking that for the whale, the most closely related mammal to the whale is actually the hippo, right? People don't think about that, but that's a very striking thing. And there's many reasons why we think that the hippo and the whale share a common ancestor. So here's a genetic principle that modern geneticists use. More closely related genomes have a more recent common ancestor. Second thing, differences between genomes can be used to estimate the historical time since the divergence. So how common the exams are, we can figure out who copied from whom and when they copied it from. So if we do that with humans, our hominid, so here we are humans, and we compare our genomes. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor 6 million years ago, and then gorilla shares a common ancestor with us 10 million years ago. Now if you take the human and you expand that out even more, here you and I are here, and then we are related to the Neanderthals and the Denisovians. These are now extinct hominins. And there are common ancestors many, many, many years ago. If we take the modern humans out, you will actually see this. So you've got the major lineages today are African, European, Asian, and Melanesian. And we know that the Africans are the oldest. They are the original humans, if you want to put it that way. And there's an ancestor about 100,000 years ago. And so the common account for biologists is that it's called the out of Africa. This is the best explanation we have for our origin, is that the human species evolved here in Africa, and over the course of time, the human species spread out all over the world. And all of us are descended from that initial common population of humans living in East Africa. So this is the first scientific consensus. Modern humans have a common origin that can be dated hundreds of thousands of years ago. They dispersed from Africa about 60,000 years ago. Now, how many original mating pairs were there? So this is more closely related to Adam and Eve, right? So are we descended from a single mating pair way back when? And in order for me to explain how we do this, I'm going to use this. So here's a beagle pedigree. So here is daddy beagle and mommy beagle. And I've got all the baby beagles, right? Does this make sense? Yes, hopefully it does. Now, if I do this, if I add a Dalmatian here, and I got 2 beagles, and I go, does this pedigree make sense? No. You actually have to say that in all likelihood, you need to have a Dalmatian with a mommy and daddy Dalmatian, and then you have there are 2 mating pairs to give rise to this population today. So biologists do that. Biologists will say, if you look at all of the people today and the diversity, right? Human beings, in a sense, where some of us are Dalmatians, some of us are, we have a diversity of genetics all over the world. How many mating pairs would you need to explain this diversity? You actually need basically a minimum of 1,000 to 2,000 mating pairs. We never get down to a single male or a single female, right? Okay. And the third scientific consensus is that there was interbreeding between the human population, African, French, Asian, and Melanesian, and there's these Neanderthals and Denisovians. So I was actually at a conference once, National Geographic, and they said, hey, do you want to have your genome sequenced? I'm like, sure, cool, we'll do it for free, great, even better. I have a vow of poverty. So what happens is they go ahead and you swab your cheek, they send your DNA back. 4% of my DNA is of Neanderthal origin. And for the most part, if you are not of African descent, that's going to range from 2 to 5% in your genome as well. If you're African descent, you do not have that. And the reason is because the people of African descent today, their ancestors never left Africa, and the Neanderthals lived outside Africa. So in order for your ancestors to have mated with Neanderthals, your ancestors would have had to leave Africa. So that, and same thing with Denisovians. Denisovians mated with individuals who are primarily of Melanesian descent. I don't have any because I'm of Asian descent. And so you've got all this Neanderthals and Denisovians mating with our human ancestors. So to answer the second question, we evolved from non-human creatures, small population, and it's out of Africa about 60,000 years ago with some interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovians. Okay, what does the Catholic Church teach about this? Now, when I talk about this, a lot of people will say, Humani Generis, paragraph 37. Absolutely. This is the most recent articulation from the Papal Magisterium. If you look at the Humani Generis in 1950, it says this: for the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. And I have a lot of people will say, this is the definitive statement that we must believe in Adam and Eve. Now, I always point out that when people read this to me, they don't read the next sentence. And I say we have to read the next sentence because the church tries to explain why is it difficult for us to believe in multiple couples. It's because it is in no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the church with regards to original sin. And the challenge was in 1950s that you could not reconcile multiple couples with original sin. Let me explain why that's the case. In order to do this, you have to ask, what role does monogynism, so monogynism is the technical term for a single couple that gave rise to all of us. What role does it play in the Catholic theological synthesis? And it is this, right? It is the best way to explain a common human nature. It is about Jesus Christ. Now, if you read the Fathers of the Church, it's very clear that part of the way that our Savior saved us is he assumed our nature. And when he assumed our nature, he elevates our nature by bringing it so closely, in the hypostatic union, he so unites it to his divinity that one day you and I will reign above the angels. Isn't that cool? You and I will. That's the most amazing. If you think about that we are closer to the angel, we are more perfect than the angels, not by virtue of our nature, because they are more perfect by virtue of their nature being pure spirits. But because of the Savior, because he united our human nature to his divinity, he raises us up above the angels. And so one of the central tenets of Catholic theology is that in order for the Savior to have saved us, he had to share the same nature as us. And one of the best ways to explain how you and I, coming from all over the planet, share the same common human nature is by positing that we are descended from the same original parent, right? And so you have a common human nature, one that was broken and one was that was redeemed. Now in 1950, with Humani Generis, the difficulty is that the prevalent biological theory at the time is that Asians, Africans, and Europeans evolved independently. And so the nature of the Asian, the African, and the European were not related to each other. And since our Savior was an Asian, right? So a Semite is Asian. If you are of European descent, because he would have assumed this nature would have been very different from that nature. And so in 1950, you could not reconcile a polygenistic account of the origins of human species with original sin. In 2017, what I hope to have shown you is that the biology has changed. We now know that Asians, Africans, and Europeans, in fact, all of the 7 billion or so people, are descended from the same population of individuals who were originally in Africa. Now you see, this is why in 2004, remember this is 2004, this is just a couple of years before Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger would be elected Vicar of Christ and successor to the Apostle Peter. In the document Communion and Stewardship, the International Theological Commission in paragraph 63 will actually say that we could have been descended from a humanoid population of common genetic lineage. So a lot of people will say, well, the church has closed off any discussion regarding monogenism and polygenism. But these are the very best Catholic theologians, chaired by one of the smartest popes in 1,000 years. And basically, there's an openness to this account of multiple couples. In fact, in paragraph 70, it says, whether as individuals or in populations. Again, there's this word population. The idea that if you have a population of common genetic origin, it would allow us to claim common human descent and therefore common human nature. So to the third question, I'm going to say this. There's been an openness in the magisterium of the church to talk about polygenism and nature, as long as this is able to fulfill the following two tasks. One, it must explain how human nature is shared, and it must be reconciled with the doctrine of original sin. So I want to propose that polygenism is still an open question, and yet I think we can still make a case for monogenism. And this is what I'm going to do in the closing minutes of my talk, is how can we talk about Adam today? How can we talk about Adam today? How can one reconcile? Because I still believe that you can talk about a single, historical, original human being who is the universal ancestor for all of us who have ever lived. And so this is why the talk is defending Adam after Darwin. I think you can do that. Let me show you how I think we can do that. The first is we have to distinguish Homo sapiens as a biological species from human beings as a natural kind. This is biology, this is philosophy. Now, biology has an underlying philosophy, another reason why seminarians need to understand philosophy, because science has philosophical presuppositions built into it, and you have to be able to grasp the philosophy to understand why biologists are thinking this way. And philosophically, biologists are nominalists. And I'm not going to go into Occam and nominalism, but biologists, my colleagues and some of my close friends, are all nominalists. They don't know it, but they're nominalists. They don't really think that a dog has dog nature. They don't really talk about nature. They want to talk about dog populations. Everything is a population. So here, what you do is you define a biological species by identifying a cluster of biological characteristics held in common by a population of individuals. You and I do this too. If I asked you, what's a dog? You're going to say, you're going to start listing characteristics. You're going to say, 4 legs, barks, and you're going to list all these characteristics down. Now, here's a problem. If you define a species based on a cluster theory, you cannot have a single distinct historical moment when one species becomes another. I'll give you an example. Define the English language. Okay? So there is no essence of English. So this is really nominalism. Define the English language. And you can sit there and you can start listing characteristics of English. But if I ask you this question, so when did Middle English become Modern English? You see, there's no one point where you can say that Middle English became modern English. Now, a lot of people say Shakespeare, but that's really historically an ad hoc. You just go, okay, there it is, Shakespeare, greatest, coolest English playwright. We'll make him. So it becomes an ad hoc account. The same thing between night and day, right? If I ask you, so when does day become night? Really interesting. Now, if you were a Jew, right, you will actually say it's, I think, when you can see 3 stars in the sky. That's when the Sabbath begins. Now, the same thing happens, for example, with the month of Ramadan. You have to specify some arbitrary line that will allow you to distinguish day and night. But this does not mean that day is night. There is a difference between day and night. So you have 2 different species. You can have 2 very different species, and it can be very difficult for you to specify exactly where one becomes another. So if you look at human beings, and if I ask you, if you think of ourselves primarily like we think of the English language, it will be very difficult for us to specify a particular point in time when we became us. But Aristotle and Aquinas will say that you and I can also understand ourselves as natural kinds. And a natural kind, he would say, a human being is a rational animal. This is Ancient of Days. He says rationality is the sign that tells you this is a human being. Now, if we can argue this, and I'm writing a book on this where I've figured out all the arguments and you're trying to argue this out, we have to look, therefore, for signs of rationality in the biological and historical record. Because if that's what makes us who we are, right, we should be able to go back and look for that. And I'm going to propose that is the capacity for language that makes us rational. And it is this because the capacity of language is inherently tied to what Aristotle and Aquinas would call abstraction. Abstraction is the ability to think about ideas. Now, when I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, I took a year off. I was an elementary school teacher, and it was absolutely essential for my formation to be a priest. I didn't know I would be a priest, but to be a 5th grade teacher was amazing, okay? Because it would force me to actually stop thinking only about myself. And I think most young people, when you graduate from college, you're just inherently narcissistic. And the challenge is to actually put that aside and think about others. And one of the most difficult things I had to teach was fractions. Now, what is a half? Right? Half is hard to teach. It really is. Because what you have to do is you take a chocolate bar, you go, this is half. You break the half. Then you take a pizza and you cut it down the middle and you say, this is half. Then you take a bottle of water and you go, this is half. And the little kid is like, and he's looking. You know, the kid is looking and he's trying to figure out what is half. It's not the chocolate. It's not the pizza. It's not the glass of water. And then I remember John Louis was looking at this and goes, oh my, he understood. He grasped the concept of half. Now, the problem is he couldn't explain it yet. So when this classmate said, what is it? They're like, and he just couldn't. He didn't have the words to explain what he had just grasped. So abstraction is that, right? And the tradition says that animals can't do that. They can imagine, they can dream, they can feel, but they can't abstract. That's what makes us radically human. And I'm proposing that the capacity for language is inherently tied to the capacity for abstraction. This is something I'm thinking through right now. For the moment, I'm just going to refer to the Authority of Thomas Aquinas in his commentary in the Gospel of John. And you'll go, why was he talking about language in the commentary on the Gospel of John? Because this is the prologue about the Word. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. And so he talks about what a word is. And he says this, and I'm just going to summarize this. He says, in order for you to think about a thought, you need to be able to talk to yourself about that thought. And this is really something striking we're going to talk about in a minute. When we think about language, we usually assume that language evolved so we can talk to another person. But if you are self-reflective, you will discover you spend most of your time talking to yourself. Now, of course, the Christian challenge is to change that, so most of the time you're speaking to God, right? And so the monologue will, in time with God's grace, be transformed into a dialogue. You are praying always, as St. Paul says, because you, instead of speaking to yourself all the time, you are speaking to your Savior. So we are rational animals, I'm proposing, because we are also speaking primates. And there's an extended argument for this. So this is a book, Noam Chomsky and Robert Berwick. These are both professors at MIT, my alma mater. Noam Chomsky is one of the world's foremost linguists. He's actually considered the father of modern linguistic science. And this is a cool book entitled Why Only Us? Language and Evolution. And I'd like to summarize some of the things that he says here. So he says, first of all, language is defined as this, the linguistic capacity for merge. Now, because a lot of my students will say, well, Father, animals have language too. And what Chomsky is pointing out is that our language is uniquely different from animal language because of this capacity. Our language is hierarchical, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. Animal vocal communication is always linear, right? So I'll give you an example. The best way is to look at this English sentence. Peter is too angry to eat. Now, it turns out that this one English sentence has two meanings. Can you see it? Okay? Right? So one meaning is Peter is too angry he cannot eat. And the other one is Peter is too angry for me to eat him. Can you see that? Now notice, you did that in the same way that my fifth graders did their abstract, figuring out what a half is. It is the same matter, but two forms. You use classical language, and you were able to abstract out from the same sentence two separate meanings. Now, so you need abstraction to do this, right? Now, it turns out that animals only can go from left to right. So, and they've done this because they've heard bird song, and you can take a bird song, and then you can use, say, your Apple computer, and you can just digitally reverse the order of the sounds, and the bird gets confused, right? The bird has to hear it from left to right, and it only comes in one order. We can do, from the same sentence, our intellectual capacity is able to read the same order of words in many, many different ways, and this is called merge. And this is what makes us able to speak and use language in the way that you and I can, in the way that even the smartest baboons cannot. So Noam Chomsky says this, right? And he says this, it is clear that language appeared very recently. And he will actually say it happened in one person. There was a single mutation that altered the architecture of the brain that allowed it to be matter that is apt to receive a rational soul. So I use the classical philosophical language for that. So what happens, there's a mutation, it changes the brain. The creature that has that is now able to speak to, it has the capacity for language. Now you notice, well, who's it speaking to? It's the only one. It starts speaking to itself. The idea is to start speaking to itself. What does it speak about? It starts speaking about dogs and cats, and it's generating all these concepts in order to form language. And the reason why we think it only happened once is because every single human being, if you take a brand new baby who was born in a Maori tribe in New Zealand and you bring him to Philadelphia, he'll be able to start speaking English within a year. In fact, one of the things that's very striking is that newborn babies cry in language-specific ways. Did you know that? So a baby who was born, two babies, English mom, French mom, they cry in different ways, and they cry depending upon the language of their mom. There is a French way of crying, and there's an English way of crying, and a German way of crying. And so the newborn baby, well, in utero, the baby is learning, it's preparing to speak the language of its parents. So it's developing brain capacities to cry even in the cadence of that language. It's inherent, it's a biological capacity, and it had to have evolved. And so the idea is that it evolved, and it happened in a single person. So here is it's called biolinguistics. Language is a hierarchical structure. This is what distinguishes our language from the vocal communication of other animals. It evolved not as a communication at first, but as an organ of thought. It appears only once, and the reason why it appears only once is because it's only 100,000 years. It's only 100,000 years, and we all share it, so it appeared only once. And the evolution depends upon this distinctive cognitive ability called merge, and I try to illustrate the capacity for merge using that sentence. So once we've clarified all of this, we can put together a model for Adam and Eve, right? And so this is a model. Hominins evolved into archaic humans that are anatomically modern about 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. What I mean by this is that if you go look at the fossil record, it turns out that there are fossils that look like us 200,000 years ago. But for about 100,000 years, there's no behavior that looks like ours. So we looked 200 years ago, if you go back to our ancestors, they looked like us, but they didn't behave like us. And this is called the Great Leap Forward. It signals you have the appearance of painting for the first time, you have the appearance of jewelry, you have the appearance of musical instruments, and their little figurines. All of this is called the Great Leap Forward, and it's thought to be linked for the appearance of language. And so a single moment in time, a single person who has this mutation, he becomes Adam. A spiritual soul is infused into him, and he is in the state of original justice. This is a theological term dealing with the nature of the human person when he was first created. And his descendants would migrate out of Africa to populate the globe. And one of the reasons why we know we are all descended from him is because we all can speak. You see, so all of us must have that mutation that allows us to speak. And if it appeared in one person, there's only one way we could have gotten it, and we would have all gotten it from that one person. And there's biological reasons for why you would think that as soon as this mutation appeared, and this person started to have the ability to think and then to speak first to himself and eventually to his progeny, who would also have the capacity to speak, that they would isolate themselves from the non-speaking primates, because you would like to hang out with someone who can talk to you. And so very quickly, this becomes a population that selects for itself. And we would say this mutation gets fixed very quickly in the population. Everyone ends up, if you have a competition between the speaking and the non-speaking, the speakers will win, because they're able to organize their group in a way that the non-speakers are not able to. And so just in terms of fitness, they're going to outcompete the non-speakers. So here it is. You have to distinguish biological species. We have to talk about rationality. I propose that the capacity for language is that sign of rationality. And there was an individual who evolved this capacity for language for the first time. He is Adam, right? And so this is the concluding slide of my presentation. Hopefully, I've been able to show you that evolution can be reconciled with a robust account of divine action. God and evolution are not opposed to each other. That evolutionary theory does not make monogenism untenable. So monogenism is Adam and Eve. I'm proposing to you that just because there's evolutionary theory doesn't mean that we cannot claim there's an Adam and Eve. That the evolved capacity for language is a marker for this common human nature that we share. I was speaking to a scientist who was working in neurobiology, and she was saying, even the most congenitally deformed human baby is still able to respond to language if that child is conscious. It's a very striking claim. It's so rudimentary to us. And that evolutionary theory does not undermine the foundations of the church's doctrine of original sin. And there are slides down the road we could talk about how then do we reconcile the fall with this. So acknowledgments, this is my, so I've got to thank a couple of people. First, Father Hyacinth Marie Cordell is one of my Dominican brothers. He entered the order of creationists, and we spent 7 years talking. And he made me understand why he was a creationist, some of the things he was worried about, the things that he was concerned about, the reasons why he did not think it could be reconciled with an authentic reading of Catholic theology. And in many ways, all of this work has been done to try to answer his questions that he raised many years ago when he was in the seminary and I was a young priest at PC. Honors, this is the spring of 2012. I teach an honors colloquium in science and religion every spring. And these are my group of incredibly talented undergraduates, honor students, and they just kept bugging me. Is there an Adam Father? Is there an Adam Father? Is there an Adam Father? And so I decided, well, let's sit down and try to figure out how we can think through this. This is my laboratory. So I run a research laboratory, and these are my students. They call themselves the Dead Yeast Society because all we do is kill yeast cells, because we want to understand the genetic program that regulates cell suicide, because tumor cells do not undergo cell suicide, which is why they can divide rapidly and form tumors. So my research group is trying to understand how we can restore that cell suicide program in tumors so that they will be able to kill themselves once again. And this is my funding. I want to highlight particularly the BioLogos Foundation, which has money from the Templeton Fund. And my Dominican brothers and I, we have a website called ThomisticeVolution.org, which is our attempt to engage faith and reason to bring the very best of Thomas Aquinas together with the best that science has to offer to show to our secular society that to be Catholic is still to be reasonable. Thank you very much. God bless you.